How many of you here today pray for that childlike heart? We're going to continue today in our series for the summer about going to Sunday school, taking some of the stories out of the Old Testament about the patriarchs, looking at them and examining them. And today, we get into one that I really like. But it also makes me sad at times. Today we're going to continue with Abraham. And we're going to be in Genesis 22, although we'll jump around a little bit into Genesis 21 and 20. But my question to you is, do you have that childlike heart? This can be a tough lesson, even though we're in Sunday school. Because how many of you learned about the sacrifice of Isaac as a child when you went to Sunday school? I know I did. Lots of it. And I think today you might see some things that are a little bit different. And we'll point some things out. And Pastor set it up really well in last week and the week before, in the fact that we are talking about faith. It's going to be a little bit different this time. Not that faith is different, but the application here is a little bit different. So if you need a Bible, raise your hand. The ushers will bring Bibles. We've got Bibles around. And we're going to be in Genesis 22. But let's pray first. Our God and Father, we thank you for the day that you have given us. We thank you for bringing us together to sing praises to you, Father, to worship you. And Father, now as we open up your word, I ask, give us that childlike heart. Give us that understanding, Father, that only comes through your Holy Spirit. Father, to apply this lesson and where we need to. It'll probably be different for each and every one of us. Father, thank you for the time that we have spent this week and for opening up visions to me. Father, hide me behind the cross of Jesus. Let it be your word said today and not my own. For we ask these things in the name of the precious Son of Jesus. Amen. Genesis 22. We're going to concentrate on verses 1 through 19. And I'm reading out of the Christian Standard Bible. It says here that after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. Here I am, he answered. Take your son, he said, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you about. So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we'll come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hands he took the fire and the knife. And the 2 of them walked together. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, My father. And he replied, Here I am, my son. Isaac said, The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them walked on together. When they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on top of the altar. On the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he replied, "Here I am." Then he said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me." Abraham looked up, and he saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that place, "The Lord will provide." So today it is said, "It will be provided on the Lord's mountain." Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn. This is the Lord's declaration. Because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sands on the seashore. Your offspring will possess the city gates of their enemies, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring, because you have obeyed my command." Abraham went back to his young men, and they got up and they went together to Beersheba, and Abraham settled in Beersheba. The Bible has a lot of difficult passages for modern readers. I'm going to get rid of this, because I like to be able to see what's going on around. That's probably the Sicilian piece in me. There's a lot of people that will look at this passage. There have been people in history that have taken it totally out of context, and they've gone and done terrible things, like kill their children. And people look at this today and they still sometimes scratch their head. It's a challenging moment when God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. The story raises up a lot of burning questions in us, and they're troubling. One is, why would God ask for something like this? Is God commanding child sacrifice? Isn't this request in conflict with everything else God seems to value? If the Bible is a unified story that leads to Jesus, then is Jesus connected to such a disturbing request? Is the love of God found anywhere in these passages? The answer to that last one is yes. And we're going to see that, and we're going to discover it. But these are questions a lot of people would have. So let's start tearing this apart. In verse 1, it says that God tested Abraham. What is he testing for? It's not so much a test to produce faith, because this ain't the first rodeo God and Abraham have been in. God has been working on Abraham's faith for decades. Go look it up. Go get some of the past chapters in Genesis. You see, God built Abraham's faith up just like he builds yours and my faith up. He doesn't do it, you've got it. He does it little by little piece by piece, year by year, decade by decade, of walking together as he builds your life and builds your faith up in him. What this is about is this is going to be a test, not to build his faith, but to reveal his faith. It says later in there, it says, take your son, he said, your only son Isaac, whom you love. God calls Isaac Abraham's only son. Is that true? No. Abraham also has another son by the name of Ishmael, from the bondservant from Egypt, Hagar. Go back a couple of chapters, you can read all about that. But this is not what God says is the promised seed. And Ishmael ends up down the road. God promises him, go back into the last chapter, they remove him. Ishmael is removed from the presence of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac. And God says that he's going to bless Ishmael as well and make a mighty nation out of him. This is where all the Arab countries come from. But according to God and according to this word, God says the promised line, the promised seed is going to come through Isaac. So in God's language, in the covenant that God has established, yes, Isaac is the only son of Abraham. But as you look through these two verses, verses 1 and 2, I want you to take a good look. Put yourself in this place. Put yourself in the place of Abraham. And every phrase that God uses, take that knife. It's just like a knife cutting into Abraham. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Offer him there as a burnt offering. What's left after a burnt offering? Do you remember our study of the tabernacle and the offerings? Nothing. Crispy critter. A lot of the other burnt offerings, you get pieces that are left and put aside for the priest, put aside for the family. You have a little barbecue afterwards. You know, not this one. Everything, all on the altar is laid. Why? What's going on here? Remember, as pastors pointed out, Abraham is a sojourner in this land. This is not his home country. He's a stranger here. The priests of many of the Canaanite gods do demand that their gods say, give us human sacrifice. And it's commonplace in Canaan at this time frame. What might Abraham be scratching his head about? See, the people of Canaan found nothing especially strange about human sacrifice. But Abraham has a different belief about his God. Yahweh is different. But is he? How many times do we scratch our head? How many times do we think, is this really what God's doing? And we question that. With this command, Abraham might have wondered if Yahweh, the God of the covenant, the creator of heaven and earth, could he be like a pagan God? But by the end of this story, if Abraham did have any doubt, he's certainly going to know that this is not what God is. It's not what God is about. In fact, he's the total opposite. You see, in this point, at this time, Abraham was doing something totally unique in God's plan of history, in God's plan of redemption. There's no way that God is going to ask one of us to sacrifice our son. There is no way. Because the significant point of this story, the uniqueness of this story, and it's going to come out later, is the point that God demonstrates, in fact, he does not want this kind of sacrifice. He does want you to lay it all on the altar. And we're going to see that here in a minute. I talked about the burnt offering. Offer him there as a burnt offering, it says. Hola. But I'm not speaking Spanish. Hola is Hebrew as well. Hola is this burnt offering. Hola means to ascend, to go up. What was the purpose of the burnt offering, of this burnt offering? This is the first of 5. We won't go into the other 4. This is about your relationship with God. This is about sacrificing an innocent animal and burning that animal, a perfect animal, by the way, on the altar so it ascends for you to commune with God, to be with God. That's what this is looking at. That's what it's about. That's the picture of it. But in this case, in this unique case with Abraham, this test was difficult in this aspect because it seems to contradict the previous promise of God. What had God said? He said the promise, your promise, the seed is coming through Isaac. Genesis 21:12, if you want to go look it up. And it seems very strange and contradictory to kill the son who the promise to carry on the covenant was taught by God. What's the issue here? Does God contradict himself? No. Can you see Abraham's little bit of confusion? But see, what Abraham has got to learn, and I think he did learn this in the case of Ishmael. Because in that case, how did Ishmael come about? Sarah and Abraham decided to take matters into their own hands because God had promised them a son before that. It took 25 years to get to Isaac. And so what did they do? Well, they took matters into their own hands. And Sarah said, go into my handmaiden. That's how you end up with Ishmael. That's not what God wanted. The thing I believe that Abraham learned out of that lesson was to trust the promiser no matter what, and the promise will be taken care of. Spurgeon, that great English stogie-chomping preacher, I love Charles Spurgeon. He's just absolutely, he was awesome. He put it this way: brethren, there are times with us when we are called to a course of action which looks as though it would jeopardize our highest hopes. It is neither our business, neither your business nor mine, to fulfill God's promise, nor to do the least wrong in order to produce the greatest good. To do evil that good may come is false morality and his wicked policy. For us, the Christian, it is duty. For God is the fulfillment of his own promise and the preservation of our usefulness. Simply put, it's God's promise, and he's going to fulfill it. And even though you may think, hey, this doesn't look right, this doesn't look like God's going to be able to do this. I can see some smiling faces out there. I know you've had this issue. It's not up to us. God is going to fulfill it in his timeline. Look at verse 3. So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his young men, and his son Isaac. And he split wood for a burnt offering, and set out to go to a place that God had told him about. How do you think he slept that night? Probably not real good. But when he gets up in the morning, do you see any sign of hesitation? No. It says he rose early to do this. He probably didn't have much sleep that night. You see, Abraham's obedience shows that he trusted God even though he didn't understand. I can't make heads or tails out of this, God, and I don't know what you're going to do. But okay, let's go do it. Instead of sometimes you and I, we probably say, I'm not going to obey or believe until I understand it all. But what does that do? And we talked about this morning. Kelly's going to laugh. That puts us on the same level as God. God, until I understand this, no. We are not on the same level as God. Abraham's obedience showed that he didn't debate or seek counsel from anyone else. He knew what to do, and he set out to do it. That's that old saying that says, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Well, that statement is wrong. Because it doesn't matter if you believe it.
Right.
Spurgeon, again, put it this way. But there's no word of argument, not one solitary question that even looks like hesitation. God is God. And he seems to say that it is not for me to ask him why or seek a reason for his bidding. He has said it, I will do it. Period. Like I said, God had been working on Abraham and training him up over decades to bring him to this place of great trust. And one of those situations is in the last chapter, and we've talked about it briefly, and that is with Ishmael. But God dealt with Ishmael in a much less severe way. He didn't tell Abraham, go out and sacrifice him. Go out and kill him. He said, no, get him away from the camp, send him out take care of him. And God came, heard Hagar, heard the child. He takes care of them. But Isaac is different. If you're thinking like Abraham, what might you be thinking? God, I don't understand, but I'm going down this road with you. It's going to become a little more clear. Look at verse 4. We're going to read the next to verse 8. And on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we'll come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hands he took the fire and the knife, and the two of them walked on together. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, "My father." And he replied, "Here I am, my son." Isaac said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them walked on together. Can you imagine thinking about, as it says here, slaughtering your son for 3 days? On the trip there, where is Moriah? Mount Moriah is exactly where Jerusalem is. It's in Chronicles 3. In fact, you ready to get blown away? This hill where he sets up the altar, many scholars believe is going to get a name down the road called Golgotha. Calvary, where Christ was crucified. Abraham had a long time to think about what God had commanded him to do. And this made the test even more severe. So I ask you, when it says, when Abraham tells the boys, the men, to stay with the donkeys, he says, "And we'll come back to you. Me and my son will come back." Did Abraham know that this was a test in what God was going to do? Absolutely not. But he did have the faith, and he did believe that he and Isaac were going to come back. Somehow, some way, nothing is impossible for God, and I don't know how he's going to do it, but he's promised me that Isaac is the promised seed. That's where it's going to come from. And if Isaac dies, there's no other descendant left. There's no probabilities of anyone to succeed him. Abraham becomes a has-been. And yet God has promised him that he's going to be the father of many nations. Can you see this all gurgling around inside Abraham's head? But we get clarity because God always gives us clarity. Sometimes it's confusing, but sometimes if we go look for it, he clears up the matter. In Hebrews 11, I loved the verse of the week. This is another verse coming out of Hebrews 11, the great hall of faith. Hebrews 11, 17 through 19. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered his only begotten son, of whom it is said, "In Isaac your seed shall be called," concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. What's that saying to you? Think about it like this week. In the 3 days that Abraham, since God talked to Abraham and said, "Go offer your son," in those 3 days, in Abraham's mind, Isaac was dead. Isaac was dead. And he knew that anything was possible. But tell me, up to this time in biblical history, has there been anybody raised from the dead? The answer to that is no. So he didn't even have that to go on. He didn't have a precedent. Yet Abraham knew God was able and God could do it. He didn't know how, he didn't know what, He didn't know when, but he said that God's able to do it. What kind of faith is that? This is the revealing. Because Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. I'm going to shift the focus just for a second. Isaac received the wood for his own sacrifice from his father, and he carried it up the hill of sacrifice. How many of us in Sunday school learned that Isaac was a wee little lad and he was... Isaac's a grown man. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. Sarah was 90. This is years after that. The Jewish historian Josephus says that Isaac was probably somewhere around 25 to 27 and may have been as old as 33. Remember that. Think of the faith that Isaac must have had. The stories and the teachings that Abraham had instilled in him, raising him up. He's a young man. Strong. Not a little toddler. It also says in these verses that Abraham, he took the fire in his hand and the knife, and he took them up the hill. I don't know about you, but if I was Abraham, I probably would have left that knife at home. Yeah. Oh, I forgot the knife. I can't kill him. Think about it. This is further demonstration of his obedience and his trust, total trust in God, that God would raise Isaac from the dead. Because Isaac hasn't even been married. He has no children. At least, God, you're going to let him live until he has a child to carry on the seed. But God, I don't know how you're going to do it. Can you see this constant churn inside his head? But by faith, he knows that God has got this. By faith, Isaac is going with it. Well, how do we know this? We see it here. It says the two of them went together. It doesn't say it once in these verses. It says it's twice. In the Greek, it's really about how they agreed to go together. Isaac is willing. Isaac is putting himself in his father's hands. Then what happens? Isaac asks, "Where's the lamb?" And his father says, "God will provide the lamb for a burnt offering." See, Abraham knows that God's got a sacrifice plan, but he doesn't know how and he doesn't know when. He just knows he's been told to sacrifice his son. And that question, I submit to you, is going to burn in the mind of all the patriarchs from now on, going forward. It's going to be on the mind of Moses. It's going to be on the mind of David. It's going to be on the mind of Isaiah. But most importantly, it's in the mind of John the Baptist. On that day when he points and declares, he sees Jesus coming out of the crowd, and he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." John 1:29. That's the sacrifice. That's the lamb that God is going to provide. But at this time, Abraham didn't know. He's still trusting in the ability of God to raise Isaac from the dead. He's not going to stop trusting in the promiser because he doesn't see how the promise is going to get done.
Amen.
And if you think about all this, right here, we have a remarkable picture of the work of Jesus at the cross. Thousands of years before it even happens. On the very place that it's going to happen. The Son of Promise willingly went to be sacrificed in obedience to his Father, carrying the wood of his sacrifice up the hill. What did Jesus carry up the hill? His wooden cross. What did Isaac carry? The wood for the offering. All with full confidence in the promise of the resurrection. Jesus knew what had to be done. But if you remember in the garden, what did he pray? If it's at all possible, Father, let this cup pass. But nonetheless, your will, not mine. Total submission to his Father. Here in the Old Testament, many people will say the Old Testament doesn't point to Jesus. Let me tell you, Jesus is all over the New Testament. We're going to see it again here in a minute. Verse 9, when they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Now remember, Abraham is much more than 100 years old. That's when Isaac was born. He's probably somewhere around 125 to 135, somewhere in there. And yet it says that Isaac didn't squiggle, didn't squirm, that he wrapped him and bound him, and he placed him up on the altar. He willingly submitted. And in this whole story, we must remember Abraham's faith, but we should never forget Isaac's faith. On top of the wood, as an obedient son, Isaac laid down, ready to be sacrificed. Then it says, and Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called out from heaven and said, Abram, Abram. And he replied, here I am. And he said, do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. Can you imagine picking up that knife? What that must have felt like. Ready to plunge it into Isaac, your own son. Hurts. Abraham knew this wasn't a drama. Abraham knew this wasn't a ceremony. And what happens? God stops it. Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. And with this, God emphatically shows Abraham that he is not like the pagan gods who worship human sacrifice. God strongly and clearly demonstrates that he didn't want that at all. What does he tell him? You have not withheld your only son from me. Abraham totally displays his heart towards God. That he's willing to do that. Does it sound familiar? that God says that love isn't in the story? God displays his heart towards us in the same way by giving his only begotten Son. John 3:16. Abram went and he saw the ram. And he said, and he went off and got the ram, took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in the place of his son. God still required the sacrifice, but it wasn't going to be Isaac. He didn't call it off. Instead, he provided a substitution. Does that sound familiar? Your Bible may say that this is the place called Jehovah Jireh. God will provide. And it says that it's still there today. Now this is Moses writing the book of Genesis, so in Moses' time it's still there. And people still refer to it as the mount where God will provide. Some 2,000 years later, God does provide. With Jesus going to the cross on that mount. You see, Abraham didn't name it anything about himself or his experience. He didn't call it Mount Trial. He didn't call it Mount Agony. He didn't call it Mount Obedience. But he named it after what God did. God will provide. And God does provide some 2,000 years later the ultimate sacrifice in his Son, Jesus the Christ. In that verse later on it says that he's going to multiply your descendants. Abraham's obedience was based on trust and faith in God's promise to bring the descendants through Isaac. And if you look at it, there's one of my favorite authors out there by the name of Henry Morris, PhD in hydrology. He's got a great book, Genesis Record. Goes through all of how it could have happened, the Great Flood, from a hydrological point of view. He also wrote a book on Revelation that's absolutely awesome. Morris calculates out the grains of sand to be on the order of 10 to the 25th power. That's huge. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring because you have obeyed my commands. By the way, in this verse, it says, the angel of the Lord, right? Who's talking? Is it an angel? In verse 15, the angel of the Lord called out to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, I myself have sworn, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, I will indeed bless you. Can that be an angel talking? It's in first person. Most scholars will tell you this is Jesus speaking from heaven. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands on the shore. All the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring because you have obeyed my command. Is this not what he was promised before, basically? Yeah. And God is now bringing forth that promise again. But who's going to fulfill this promise? Yes, the promise is going to come through the seed of Isaac. Yes, it's going to come down from even more people. But who is the promised one? The Messiah, Jesus, the Christ, is the one that God is pointing to. The promise to bring forth the Messiah is what it's talking about from Abraham's lineage. And it's also repeated earlier in Genesis in chapter 12. Remember, it's the only Son of God the Father. And he's going to fulfill this promise to all the nations on the earth. For many centuries after God's command to Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, Jesus said, your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. That's John 8, verse 56. What is this a reference to? It's a reference to Abraham's joy in seeing the ram caught in the thicket. And the ram was the substitute that would save Isaac's life. Seeing that ram was in essence seeing the day of Christ. A substitute for each and every one of us. So yes, this story, this lesson, it does raise some questions. But they're all answered if you just go dig a little bit and find out who God really is in this story. Because yes, there's going to be times when we're asked to lay it all on the altar. And the big key to that, because we're going to question it. I guarantee you we're going to question it. But the key to it is to believe in the promiser and not in the promise. It's not our job to do God's job. Who walked through the covenant God made with Abraham? God did. And why was it only God that walked through it? Pastor taught on this last week. Because he knew Abraham was not able to fulfill his part. God and God alone is able to do this. And that's why I ask you today, this simple Sunday school lesson, do you have a heart of the child? Are you open to what God's talking to you about? Are you ready to lay it all out there? Because many times, God's going to ask you to. But just like in this case with Abraham, as long as you're willing, he's going to make a different way. And he's not going to require you to go through it. But he is going to require you to have the faith and the ability to do it if he wants it done. He may want you just to come to him and ask him for the direction. Believe in the promiser, not in the promise. Don't try to make it happen.